Hello, and welcome to part 2 of managing projects and really managing change projects successfully through stakeholder engagement. Every device that I have in front of me now says that it is noon Eastern time, so I guess it's time to get started. I want to thank you for joining me in this part 2 presentation. My name is Robin Heisick, and I am a management consultant with Pink Elephant. I've been with Pink Elephant for going on 12 years now, though a lot of my background is in IT, and I grew up in the world of IT service management. My main passion is change, behavior change, people change, organization change. I have a master's degree in organizational development, and I'm here to share just a few minutes with you about using effective communication techniques to gain buy-in to your change or to your change vision. Now, last week we talked about stakeholders and who are our stakeholders. And for those of you who were here, we learned the first principle of stakeholder leadership or stakeholder engagement, which is you can forget important stakeholders, but they won't forget you. Now that we've had time to spend understanding who our stakeholders are, our job is to engage them and get them on board so that they choose to be part of our change effort, to walk the journey with us going toward the new state that we're changing to. So today what we'll talk about is communication. Why do we communicate? What do stakeholders want to know when we're communicating with them? How do we use a marketing technique to help market the change? Isn't that what we're doing after all? Trying to get people to buy in, again, to choose to be part of the change, and so we're using advertising marketing to help us do that. And then I have a couple of things I'm calling the ABC of communication here. So once we understand what we need to communicate, how do we effectively communicate those changes? At the very last slide, the very last wrap-up with questions, I also have a short list of reading that you can do, some of the things that I took in preparing this presentation, and I will point those out to you when we get to that slide. I have trouble with this little clicker. All right, so really, when we're talking about communicating change or communicating our change vision, there is really one and only one reason we're communicating. We're communicating to get buy-in to the change. When we have a change initiative, a change objective, we need a lot of people who are on board, who can see that there is a desirable future for them with whatever this change instance is, and for them to become highly motivated to have a role to play and to be supportive of the change. If we focus on buy-in as our main objective when we communicate, it will help us narrow down the types of communications to achieve that buy-in and help us understand, as you're going to see in one of the later slides, that we need to be able to communicate over and over and over again in order to reach people, really, I'm going to say, where they live. What do stakeholders want to know? So if you remember last week, what we had were a number of different stakeholder groups in a sample change that we were talking about. Some of those stakeholders we could just communicate information to and say, well, this is what's happening, we thought you needed to know, because they were marginal or peripheral to the change, let's say. Other stakeholders who have a feeling of, whether it be real or perceived, have a feeling of things are really going to change for them, and they have things that they lose because of our change, as well as they might have things that they might gain for our change. So a lot of our change communication, our change engagement strategies is focused on that type of stakeholders. And of course, what do they want to know? We all want to know this. What's in it for me? What do I have to gain if I am on board and choose to follow you, again, in this journey of the change that you are trying to drive or lead forward? Now, last week there was a question that came up at the end of the session. And I didn't look to see if the person who asked the question at the end was on board or not. Maybe you're here. But the question was, where do we really see the biggest resistors to change, or where do we see issues of the change being pushed away? And so I quickly went and I added this slide to what I want to show you today. It ties into that question a bit, but it's also going to tie into the rest of the topic areas that we have in this presentation. So we're going to call this a formula. What we're going to say here, this is from, you might hear it in two different ways. It's from a couple of gentlemen, Beckert and Harris, but they also attribute it to somebody by the name of Gleicher. But in any case, this is a change model or a change formula. The reason I want to show this to you is when I start talking about change management in any context, it always comes back to this. This is the one thing we need to know when we're working with others, as well as when there are changes that impact us personally, to help us understand what it takes for people to become motivated and for them to want to buy into your change. So D, first a person has to have a dissatisfaction with the status quo. They need to have the basic understanding that we cannot continue to do what we're doing today. If it's an individual, we cannot continue to eat lots of cookies and cupcakes and things like that with the sugar element that they have in it today, or we might be on the verge of type 2 diabetes, or we might have other kind of health issues that are related to that. So it's really tied to an element of urgency or an element of shock that we can't continue to work this way. If a person does not have some level of dissatisfaction, and in my case, sometimes an extreme level of dissatisfaction or knowledge of the reason that we can't continue to be the way we are, they are not going to be open, most likely, to the change initiative we're trying to put forward. People also need to have a vision, almost that they could touch and feel, if you will, of the positive possibility of what the future state would look like. So it needs to be more than just the absence of pain from the way we are working today. It needs to be something that is going to be important to them, that is something that they believe that is the right thing for either themselves personally or the organization to go in that direction. And finally, they need to understand how to get there. So F stands for first steps. What is your plan for driving the change forward? What does it mean to me? Am I going to have to go through weeks of training? Am I going to have to do some other things that are not comfortable to me? Change is uncomfortable, by the way. And so when we look at the D, the V, and the F, if one or more of these are not present, then it's not likely that people are going to be motivated to be on board with you, and that is really more likely that they're going to be resistant to change. Now, we all have this within ourselves as being leaders of change and now communicators of change. We need to be able to understand where people are in relation to the change that we are leading. Are they dissatisfied, or do they understand the urgency for the organization to change? Are we able to communicate the path forward in terms of a good vision, and do we have a plan to get there? The way we can understand where some of these people or groups of people are coming from is an element we talked about last week, which is looking at an empathy map, understanding the stakeholder group, what they see on a daily basis, what they hear on a daily basis, what they say and do, what they think on a daily basis, to help us understand these different elements. I guess in that a lot of it is the dissatisfaction. If we look at these another way, the D and the V and the F, if we have the person understanding the dissatisfaction, we're able to communicate a good vision and the first steps. Those are driving forces. driving the motivation and eventually the momentum toward making the change happen. However, we've got the force that pushes back on that, the restraining forces. So again, part of our communication is going to be tying into these elements. How can we communicate in a way that people clearly understand why we cannot continue to operate as we have been? What is our vision for the next journey or the next part of our journey, and how do we get there? All right, now how could we use some techniques to then go forward with that communication? So we'll keep tying back to the D and the V and the F as we go through some of this. I'm going to be talking about a model for marketing the change. And so first, people need to become aware, what is the change? They need to know the D. What does it mean to them? What does it mean to the organization? Why can't we continue to operate the way that we are? What is that vision? What are the first steps before they make the necessary emotional commitment? If you remember, I've been saying a couple times now, choose to be on board with you and want to play a part in making the change happen. This marketing technique we could call AIDA, A-I-D-A. I know oftentimes when I'm presenting elements about change management, I'll present from dates like 1995 or 2002, and people will say, well, these are kind of old dates. Well, I'm even going to go back further with this one. The first time this concept of AIDA was talked about in relation to sales and marketing was in 1899. So I do want to present that to say it's still relevant in marketing today, and we're going to talk about this technique in this slide in the next to show how we can lead people through the journey of this understanding by communicating elements of the change. So A is attention. First, we need to grab attention. The I is interest. Then we need to get into the what's in it for me in helping people become interested in understanding what that change means. Then we hope to provide enough information to get people on board enough that they have a desire to make a decision or a commitment to this change. And then action is that they actually get on board and have a role to play. Let's talk about each of these a little bit more, just a touch more individually. So attention. Capture their attention. Highlight the importance. What is the reason for this change? Is there urgency for this change in that we need to make this change or really bad things are going to happen to our organization, to the individual, to the entire corporation or enterprise? There are different ways of grabbing attention. We can actually add a shock factor where, shock, if we don't do this, we're going to have to close the doors of our organization within 2 months, let's say. We could use a personalization factor and really point out where the change is aimed at a person specifically. It's hard to ignore something that's aimed at you specifically. In terms of communication techniques, this can be a one-way communication, really just letting people know, I need your attention, this is going to happen. That one-way communication needs to be followed very quickly by communication to build their interest. So we don't want to really just shock them and then go away, because that would leave a whole other type of problem or churn that we would have to worry about later. So building their interest again is tied into what does it mean for me? What's in it for me or with them, we say a lot. And so again, this is where understanding the motivation of our individual stakeholder groups is going to benefit us, helping us to understand what's relevant to each of them and to be able to show the gains and the losses for each stakeholder group. To do this, this is no longer one-way communication. This is a two-way communication where people have the opportunity to ask questions, provide feedback, and have their questions answered. A good person, if they've bought into the change, to help with this might even be the group's direct manager, to help them understand, because they understand mostly what's going on with the group, can help with that particular discussion. Okay, we need to build their interest and then create the desire, show how the change will satisfy their needs. So that's that vision. How will the change satisfy their needs, as well as really starting to talk about and what do we need to do to get there? What do you need to do personally to get there? By grabbing the desire, this is where we are again getting that decision point to happen. With information and communication, this is where we want to continue to communicate. We want to give people opportunities to get communication where and how they need it. Maybe a wiki on our website, maybe SharePoint access, maybe posters on the walls, maybe little videos they can go see. So giving them communication that they can see in their own time to help them absorb it in their own time frame and to be able to help create that desire for the change. And then lastly, of course, what we want is action. We want people to say, okay, not only am I choosing to agree with you and to be on board with this change initiative you want to happen, but I want a role to play. I'm ready. Put me in there. Here's what I want to do. We could call this, and sometimes in our organizations, a call to action, getting the people motivated and wanting to be on board. So again, that's a real simple model, AIDA, but has very powerful importance when we're looking at helping to lead people along this journey with us. All right, so we've got people on board. As we're communicating, how do we communicate effectively? A, art of simplicity. So I actually like the little quotes. If I had more time, I'd write you a shorter letter. Okay, and now I'm predating 1899 to 1623, where that quote is. We could present the details of our change simply. Take out any acronyms, any jargon, any buzzwords. Certainly include wording that is relevant and important in our organization, but nothing that gets in the way of understanding the change. Present simply in very simple statements instead of long paragraphs that have the change initiative buried within them. Pick one point for a particular communication, one theme or one idea, instead of trying to communicate everything within one email or one mode of communication. Again, people need time to absorb what you're telling them and to mentally be able to go through and figure out what this means to them. B, be the change, walk the talk. This isn't just the person who is the sponsor of the change. This would be that person and people who are amongst their leadership team, people who are brought in to help them by supporting the change. So this is maybe the head of the organization as well as the direct management staff. So communication is much more about the things that you do than the things that you say. As a leader of change, we are always being watched and scrutinized. Any misstep might misinform people in our true priority for this change. People emulate their role models. Communicate the change vision frequently in many different ways. And so you doing it simply and one message at a time, we want the consistency and repetition, again, not just from the sponsor of the change, but from different levels of management as well with that consistent message, even though there are different people. Repeat with multiple channels. So we could have channels like, again, we could have newsletters, we could have workshops that people go to, we could have one-on-one conversations. People are going to absorb the information differently. We want to make sure that we're providing enough so that they can't say, A, I didn't know, and B, I don't understand. And then C is use different channels that work. And so George Bernard Shaw, the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. Just because we have written words or spoken words does not mean that the exact message was received as intended. So deliver the message in person, not just through email, especially when there's a potential emotional response to the change. Make the communication two-way, so there's discussion and dialogue. As we're doing that, we're learning more about the stakeholder group and sometimes more information that even helps broaden our thinking on how to make this change occur. Deliver the communication through several sources. And our bullet says people are more likely to adopt change if their manager discusses with them, but also if we have a peer group who are on board with the change and who have maybe already made the change, that's a really good source where people can say, oh, it worked for them. I've been sitting on the fence waiting. Now if it worked for them, it should work for me. Use stories, use metaphors. So people are, your brain works in two different ways, the logic side and the imagination side. Stories talk to people. They help with that vision in providing that compelling picture of what the future might look like for them, what's in it for me. Stories are big right now, and because they work. Now, these are stories that are purposeful stories and stories that are intended to show a direction. Storytelling, what I'm going to show you across this slide, is really the components of storytelling. And this is whether you're writing a book or whether you're telling a story about how we slayed the dragon in our organization and got to this point and what we need to do similarly to get to the next state. So we have a character in our story. And really what we like as people, no matter who you are or where we are, that character makes sense for us if there's some form of conflict. And the deeper the conflict and the more conflict, usually the more interesting that is to grab our attention. At some time in the story, there's some kind of a spark that for our main character is starting to resolve that conflict. Then doesn't necessarily mean in a happy direction, but the spark could even mean that they've learned something from the conflict that they're in. That spark creates a change in our character. And then finally, the story will have some kind of a takeaway message. So the more that you could use this as a formula in creating your stories and testing your stories on people who can give you good feedback about your stories, the better your stories will work for you in effective communication. All right, so I used the word purposeful before. Again, when words just spill out of our mouth or when we write, and especially if we're doing something in a text or an email message, they aren't always thought through. We want to look at what is our objective for communicating. Remember, it's to get buy-in. Our objective is to help people understand why we can't continue to operate the way we are today, the D. Or our purpose is to communicate the vision of the future that we want to lay out. Or our purpose is to get people to understand what do they need to do to buy into this change. So purposeful and consistent communication. One of the big leaders of change, John Cotter, in his book Leading Change, talks about the power of 10. So purposeful, consistent, and plentiful communication. What he says is that managers under-communicate, and often not by a small amount. Sometimes by a factor of 10, 100, or even 1,000. So again, people need to know, they need to hear communication over and over and over again, using the ABC that we told you about in the earlier slides, making sure it is consistent, and again, remember, communication is lying in everything we say, decisions that we make, things that we do, people that we are engaging ourselves with. All of that is an element of communication. The bottom line here, the bottom of this slide, under communicating may lead to a stalled transformation. We need to communicate to succeed. Major change, or even most change, is not possible until we get the people who are our major stakeholders on board with us and playing those roles to make this happen. Okay, so kind of wind down here, giving you a reading list. And so I did mention John Kotter, Leading Change, the TED Talk storytelling and the 7 steps for storytelling is where that actual list that went across, starting with the character and the conflict. I want to point out the second bullet, get to know and use AIDA or ADA. This is a link, and I am to tell you, you will receive these slides or a PDF of the slides, so you will have this as well as the recording sometime in the next few days. I wanted to point out the link, and I want to point out at the bottom of the link, there's a good video that is showing ADA in practice. The only caveat I want to say is that the language is pretty foul in that, and so I want to let you know that before you hear it. It's a clip from a movie from 1992 called Glengarry Glen Ross, with Alec Baldwin, Al Pacino, Jack Lemmon, Alan Arkin, which actually a movie that stemmed from a play from 1984. So if you can deal with the foul language, take a look at that video, and again, you'll see the shock element of the attention and how that worked for getting people in a real estate office to get on board with increasing their sales. All right, so I've only left 3 minutes for us. If you have any comments or questions, I guess you put them into the Q&A. And if you need to leave, I want to again thank you for joining us today. I don't see any questions. All right, I don't see any questions. Again, thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day.